Good morning. As you can see in this world of virtual reality, that what I say doesn't quite match up with my lips are. Welcome to my living room. Welcome to the view of people's ceilings. That get used to looking at the view of people's ceilings. This is strange. I feel strange. You probably do too, but we'll try to survive this. Obviously, there's other activity going on around my house. You'll see occasional things, hear occasional things. Get used to that too. So let's start off with prayer. Dear God, we just thank you so much that we know no matter what's going on around us, that that you're in control, you're in charge, and that those who believe in you, who have called your purpose, things will work out. Will always work out the way you want them to. We just pray that you help us not to be afraid, but to trust in you and to look at what's good about the things that appear not to be good, and to look at what you're doing for us. We ask this in your name. Amen. First off, if you talk to your parents, they talk about where they were during 9/11. You talk about your grandparents, they'll talk about maybe where they were when Kennedy was assassinated. But so you guys have the privilege of talking about where you were during the great pandemic of 2020. So think a little part of history, you're being a little bit a part of history. So we're going to try to do some notes here. Where we stopped, the notes I gave you all to take was on page 965 if you're in your book, and which is the Arsenal of Democracy. Okay, and we'll try to finish out that chapter. We'll discuss later when we do the test and how we'll do the test. So hopefully everybody is rolling along, getting those videos done, getting those nice 105 points added up to your average. So we talked about the beginnings of World War II. You watched the videos. The videos are part of your notes, the notes you took, work there. So Arsenal of Democracy refers to what's going on in the United States. We had entered the war, and so we're going to add this slide here. So just give me a moment here, and I'll share the screen. There you go. All right, so basically, to fight Germany, to fight Japan, took all the resources we have. We live in a time now when we need all our resources to deal with a different type of battle that's going on. So December 18th, 1941, remember Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Congress passed what was called the War Powers Act, which basically gave the government the authority to reorganize not only government agencies, but also the industrial capacity of the country as well, too, to get us on a war footing. And even do things like censor mail and restrict things that people were allowed to say. And of course, we're declaring war, so you're going to have soldiers. So the draft was declared for everyone between the ages, all men, between the ages of 18 and 45. So somewhere around 16 million men and hundreds of thousands of women actually served in the military during the war. That was a bunch. In 1940, Hitler, when somebody made the comment about what the United States could do, he kind of joked at the idea that it was possible to us to come up with 50,000 airplanes a year. Reality was we did a lot more than that. Okay, we basically, our war output was more than all the other countries combined on the other side. So here's your first note for your test question. The War Production Board was created by Roosevelt in 1942, and the War Production Board was a government agency that was responsible for overseeing the conversion of all industries to war production. So there's a question on that. Sounds like a multiple choice question to me. All right, but you got to pay for this stuff, okay? So we had to finance the war in some capacity. And so the war ended up costing more than $3 million in today's terms, which if you think about it, is probably less is going to be spent on the pandemic just this year. They already talked about $2.2 trillion and then going beyond $3 trillion. Easily there's another phase that's going to come in. So in the middle of history. So got to pay for it somehow. Congress passed the War Revenue Act of 1942. In 1939, only about 4 million people, somewhere around 5% of the workforce, had ever been required to pay taxes. You might remember we talked about that earlier in the course about how few people actually paid taxes and how little they paid. But by the end of the year, by the end of the war, 90% of workers were paying income tax, which is a big jump from 5%. But somewhere a little bit less than half of military costs during the war were covered by tax revenues. The rest was debt. And part of that was like selling war bonds. They were borrowing money from the people they had to pay back plus interest. By the end of the war, national debt was 6 times what it had been before the start of the war. Federal government obviously increased to handle all this. Bureaucracy grows whenever there's a program going on. More than a dozen new federal agencies were actually created to deal with all these issues. The number of workers quadrupled, went from 1 million to 4 million during this time. And the unemployment rate, remember we're in the midst of the Great Depression, so here's our solution to massive unemployment. Unemployment rate in 1940 was 14%. By 1943, it was down to 2%. People who had maybe not been involved in work at all, working very much, were now involved. Lots of women were employed. And some of you may have seen the old Kurt Russell movie, Swing Shift, about some of the things that took place during the war. And so a lot of people saw this as basically this is the beginning of the end of the Depression. That would bring jobs to people, bring better living to people. Of course, you got this in production increase has to be supported by materials, and so there would be a shortage of materials, so there would be some amount of control about what people were allowed to use. Basically, consumer goods were cut back significantly as civilian industries moved over to wartime production. 1942, Congress created the Office of Price Administration to control prices, so you didn't have price gouging. Some of the issues we're facing now, shortages of critical material like toilet paper, and people trying to make their money out of that. Basically, other things were rationed. Okay, citizens got coupons that indicate how much gasoline they could buy during the week, that sort of thing. Automobile tires, things like sugar and coffee, those things had to be rationed. People also collected scrap metal and other things like cardboard for military use, and people were even asked to save cooking fat. Cooking fat was a source of glycerin, which could be used to make explosives. So basically, and it worked pretty well. The prices were stabilized. Things did get better. So I got to get my slide to advance here. All right. So basically, remember, we've been led into this war by what was going on in the Pacific by the attack on Pearl Harbor. We already talked about that. That's a significant part of what was going on. There's some pictures there. And these are some of the basic things that we talked about that required us to get through all this well. All right, that brings us to the war at home. And this is one of your essay choices, okay? On the Chapter 25-26 test, there's a essay choice in the war at home, so you might want to make sure if you want to answer that question, be prepared. Obviously, lots of things changed with what was going on, particularly in the social life. Women in war was a big thing. I already mentioned that. Before a little bit east of Sweetwater is the Wasp Museum. Before we got shut down here during spring break, our plan was to go visit the Metroplex, and I was going to stop by there, but that obviously didn't happen. But basically, it was a big change for women. With millions of men going to military service, lots of civilian jobs became open, increase in civilian jobs with the War Production Board's efforts. And as a result, women were drawn into the workforce that never have been that many before. As many as 350,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps, or the WAC, or the Navy's equivalent, which was called the WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. and the Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and the Army Air Force. In addition, the WASP were actually women's air service pilots. They were civilians. Basically, what they did was transport aircraft, flew aircraft from the factories to the ports where they could be shipped overseas. More than 8 million women entered the civilian workforce. And for a lot of women, they were happy to be able to get out of home life and be able to get increased wages. They were not the only ones that were affected by this. African Americans also were affected. More than 500,000 African Americans left the South for better opportunities in the North, and more than 1 million blacks nationwide were involved in industrial work for the very first time. Basically, the African American population of cities like Seattle, Portland, and Los Angeles, where you had all these shipping industries involved, significantly increased the African American population. At the same time, in the South was again cotton, textile mills. Jobs increased there as well too. Uniforms had to be produced for the military, and so manufacturing jobs allowed a lot of people to leave the land where they weren't getting much done anyway and go for steady work in the cities and small towns. 60 of the 100 Army camps were in the southern states primarily because of weather. Basically, in states like Texas, there were Army airfields all over the place, plus big training bases as well too. But it wasn't just the civilian workforce. African Americans were also involved in uniform. That was probably one of the biggest issues at the time. In 1941, the military forces were still racially segregated. There were black units, but the black units were commanded by white officers, and they were segregated from the others. And many times, the African American soldiers would be used really for things like construction and transportation and things like that. Some of you might have seen a movie called The Red Ball Express, which is about just that very thing. Somewhere around 1 million African Americans, men and women, would serve in the armed forces during the war. Black soldiers and sailors were put in racially segregated units. They loaded ships, they drove trucks. Black officers could not command white soldiers or sailors. Many times in the Navy, they would be cooks. You probably have remember some stories about that in your Texas history, maybe about famous people involved. And of course, some of you have heard the Tuskegee Airmen. There was a television movie called The Tuskegee Airmen. And of course, the Red Tails was a Hollywood-based movie. The Tuskegee Airmen was better. They're both movies worth watching. And the Tuskegee Airmen, that's a worthy topic if somebody wants to research that. Basically, these were the first African-American military pilots. And basically were trained at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. One of the leaders that came out that had already served with Canada. Many Americans had become involved in the war earlier than 1941 by joining British, French, and Canadian military forces. By late 1944, things had gotten bad enough that the military realized it needed to use African Americans for more than just driving trucks and cooking and ships and things like that. And not such a big push from President Roosevelt. He was not a big social activist, but his wife Eleanor Roosevelt really was. In fact, one of the interesting stories there was she actually went to visit the Tuskegee Airmen and actually demanded that she be allowed to fly with one of the students, which the higher ups were not happy about. But she was, after all, the first lady, and she got what she asked for. So she was a big pusher. Dwight Eisenhower was not particularly happy about some of these activities either, but he finally allowed black volunteers to fight in units in Europe, but they were still commanded by white officers. So basically, the Tuskegee Airmen flew first in North Africa, and then eventually they would get P-51s, and they would be responsible for flying support for bombers going into Germany, which is what you saw in the movie Red Tails. And they had a reputation for not losing any bombers. Okay, they flew over 15,000 missions, and basically they did very well. But of course, once the war was over, everything went back to normal, went back to segregation. We'll talk about later how the segregation finally goes away. Here's a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen. Same on your book if you have a book. All right. Mexican Americans also were affected too. Basically, before the war, migrant laborers had been pushed back across the border to Mexico because of the shortage of jobs, but now they were recruited to come back and start doing harvesting. So here's another test question for you. The Bracero program, if you have your book, you should easily find that. If you don't have your book, then that's Bracero. There's a test question, the Bracero program. In the Bracero program, somewhere around 200,000 Mexican American farm workers were brought back into the western states, pretty much most of them packed on cattle trains and cars to try to bring in a harvest. Somewhere around 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the war. They had a higher percentage of congressional medals of honor, the highest military honor in our country than any other minority group, but there was still a lot of racial prejudice, particularly in places like Southern California, the Southwest, where there were a lot of Mexican Americans. There was a lot of conflict between white servicemen and Mexican American gang members called zoot suiters, okay? Look that up, find a picture of somebody with a zoot suit. Some of it look strange, some of it will look a little bit familiar to you, maybe. So in 1943, several thousand off-duty sailors and soldiers and a lot of other people basically went through Los Angeles assaulting Hispanics, African Americans, Filipinos. That was called the Zoot Suit Riots. Native Americans were also involved. Navajo code talkers, basically almost a third of eligible Native American men served in the armed forces. Some of them did different things. One of the, if you're familiar with the raising the flag of Iwo Jima, one of the men raising the flag of Iwo Jima was an African American. But they were involved in a lot of activities. And one you might be most familiar with is the Navajo code talkers. One of the things that we figured out in trying to maintain security, maintain secrecy in transmissions, was that just like we were able to break a lot of Japanese and German codes, they were able to break some of our codes too. So one of the solutions was to use Navajo speaking Navajo language. They were called wind talkers or code talkers, and there are some movies about them as well. Okay, and so the Germans and Japanese had no real way of knowing Navajo. That would have been very, very strange. The last thing on this slide, you notice there's discrimination against Japanese Americans. This is probably one of the most controversial and maybe most shameful areas in American history. We practice a lot of things that we shouldn't have. This is one of them. Basically, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese created a lot of vengeance against the Nisei. That's Nisei. The Nisei were people of Japanese descent living in the United States, okay? Actually, there's a term Nisei and Isei. Nisei means that they were actually born here, but they were, again, of Japanese descent. Isei, I-S-S-E-I, would be what you would call your first generation Japanese. They migrated here from Japan, and then they had children who were born here. That would be the Nisei. So therefore, the Nisei would be native-born American citizens. But to people, particularly the West Coast, it really wasn't a big issue in other parts of the country, but particularly for people on the West Coast who were the closest to Japan and they were most afraid of what might happen. They were very much afraid of the fact that they could easily be attacked. There was a lot of animosity towards Americans of Japanese descent. And to a lot of these people, there was no difference between people in Japan or people in this country who were born here who were of Japanese descent. And so another test question for you. One of the things that happened here is they ended up with actually the country backing them up, okay? One of the worst violations of civil liberties in the 20th century. Over 120,000 Nisei were removed from their homes, their properties were confiscated, and they were transported to 10 relocation camps throughout the West, basically in pretty remote places. My wife's family, when she was young, actually, after World War II, moved to Idaho to homestead for 6 years, and they lived on a property that had once been a relocation camp, and even used buildings that were barracks in the relocation camps. And so the people were given like 48 hours to sell, and obviously they didn't sell things at very good prices, get rid of everything and everything they could bring with them, and they were taken by train to these barbed wire enclosure internment camps, basically concentration camps. Okay? They lost their property and they lost their liberty. But that did not keep Japanese Americans from serving in the military. Even though their parents, their families might be in a concentration camp, they were still willing to go and fight. Obviously, they fought in Europe, in the Western theater, not in the Pacific theater, but that would have created way too much confusion in the Pacific theater. President Roosevelt actually issued the relocation order, executive order 9066, February 19th, 1942, basically said that all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, the Pacific Coast, would be removed. Roosevelt called it a military necessity, although throughout the entire war, there never was one single incident of Japanese Americans involved in espionage. More than 70% of those put in the relocation camps were actually U.S. citizens. In fact, 39,000, I said they served, 39,000 Japanese Americans served in the war. And then it went for a long time. It wasn't until 1983 that the government acknowledged that what they had done was unfair. And in 1988, it finally granted any Nisei still living $20,000 in compensation, which really wasn't very much. All right, that brings us to our next topic. Here's a picture of some Navajo code talkers. And here's Japanese Americans being moved to internment camps. Notice the soldiers on the right there. All right, that brings us to, if you follow along your book, page 973, the Allied drive towards Berlin. We're attacked December 1941. We're involved in war by the middle of 1942. We're starting to hear good reports back from what's going on in Europe. Basically, we've been able to destroy a lot of German U-boats off the Atlantic coast and able to pretty much bring under control the submarine attacks. What that allowed was to help us help our allies well. And so pretty much the effort became a Europe-centered effort to defeat Germany first. Japan was considered a secondary target, although obviously we fought there throughout the entire war. The big idea was fighting on the Eastern Front against Soviet Union. During 1941, 1942, the Nazis and the Soviets had big battles. Okay, the Soviet population was one of the ones who felt the brunt really of the war against the Nazis. And so Stalin, obviously, he had his issues, but he certainly was concerned about his people, or at least his country, or at least his power to some degree. Felt like that it was important for the Americans and the British to do something to help relieve the pressure on his troops, okay? And it was important that there would be some sort of attack on Germany from the West to force Germany to pull some of their forces back from the Russian front. Franklin Roosevelt representing the United States, Winston Churchill representing the British, agreed that they needed to do that, but they couldn't agree on where, when, how it would be done. Okay, U.S. military planners wanted to attack the Germans in France before the end of 1942. Churchill, of course, argued that this was a way of maybe losing the war. They finally compromised and agreed to attack the German and Italian forces in North Africa. And that's what brings us to the North Africa campaign, which again, as I already mentioned, was where the Tuskegee Airmen were first involved in combat. So November 8th, 1942, combined British and American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, what was called Operation Torch. The commander of this was a former staff officer by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. George Marshall was the commander, chief of staff of the U.S. Army, and Eisenhower was one of his favorite guys. Eisenhower never actually led in combat, but he was a very brilliant strategist, and so he was put in charge of the invasion of North Africa. And basically, we attacked Libya, so British armies are already pushing the Italians and the Germans back across Libya. Early battles didn't go very well. However, in 1943, Eisenhower went to an old buddy of his by the name of George Patton and found a field commander who could fight. So basically, we were able to attack from one side, the British attacking from the other side, and finally on May 12th, 1943, 250,000 Germans and Italians surrendered, and basically North Africa was now under Allied control. You might remember from the videos that we saw earlier what had happened there. So now we need to talk about that. Brought us to something called the Casablanca Conference, okay? When all this is going on, early in 1943, there'd been a meeting. Roosevelt, Churchill, and other military leaders met in Casablanca. That was the largest city in French Morocco, also famous with some movies there too. And it's the first time that an American president had ever flown abroad while in office, and nobody had ever visited Africa. So this was a new thing for Roosevelt. The Casablanca Conference, there is a test question on the Casablanca Conference. Make sure you've got good notes on this. At the Casablanca Conference, the British were able to convince the Americans that at this time we had not had our victory in North Africa, but it looked like that's where we're headed. And they were able to convince the Americans that after we finished our victory in North Africa, we need to turn to the other side of the Mediterranean Sea and assault Sicily and then Italy. And so Roosevelt and Churchill decided to do that and also increase the bombing of Germany and also increase the shipment of supplies to the Soviet Union, and also to give some help to the East, help the nationalist Chinese who were fighting the Japanese. So at the end of the Casablanca Conference, one of the things that came out of that was Roosevelt and Churchill announced that the war would only end with the unconditional surrender of all enemy nations, that they'd have to give up and accept whatever happened to them. All right, that brings us on your slide to the Battle of the Atlantic. Basically, we're fighting in North Africa, and the Battle of the Atlantic reaches its climax, okay? German submarines were operating in wolf packs, operating in groups of submarines, not just sole submarines, and they were sinking these British ships that were transporting American goods, and they were actually sinking ships faster than the British could even replace the ships. And obviously, if we didn't have the supplies, didn't have the troops, there was no way we were going to invade France. So basically, the U-boats had to be taken care of. By the end of 1942, we actually came up with some ways we might be able to do that. One thing that was important was that the British had cracked the German codes, and they were able to figure out what the naval vessels were being told to do, and so they could use that information to figure out where the U-boat wolf packs were and to stay away from them, and then send in hunters, sub-chasers, ships and warplanes with anti-submarine weapons to attack them. Also sonar and radar. Radar, remember, had been developed by the British, and sonar was basically, it operates technologically quite a bit different than radar, but it's the same principle that it helps you detect where something is located. So we're now able to use sonar and radar to track submarines. May 1943, we destroyed 41 submarines, and after that, it was no longer about the submarines chasing us, it was about us chasing the submarines. And so after that, lots of shipping was able to get through. All right, next thing in your slide is Sicily and Italy. So again, remember Casablanca Conference, we'd agreed after a win in North Africa, which took place in May, that we would continue with the invasion of Sicily and Italy. So July 10th, 1943, about 250,000 British and American troops landed on the coast of Sicily. By about 5 weeks later, we were in control of Sicily, and basically, before it was all over, Mussolini lost his power. On July 25th, 1943, here's another test question for you. Italian king, remember, I mean, I don't remember, you probably didn't know this, okay, there was still a king in Italy. Mussolini was operating as a prime minister, basically as a dictator, but he was operating technically as prime minister. On July 25th, 1943, the Italian king basically fired Mussolini, had him arrested, and the new government offered the Allies and said, we not only want to surrender, we want to switch sides, we want to start fighting for you guys. Hitler found out about this. He obviously did not want more allies, so he sent more German troops into Italy to keep Italy under control. He had done the same thing in Greece as well, too. The Greeks had kind of lost interest in fighting, but Germany wanted to keep that going. So test question on that. Pretty much, though, not much happened, really. The rest of the war was just a series of battles that really didn't accomplish much in Italy. And so basically, the Germans had tough terrain in the north, tough for us to attack against, getting up into the mountains, getting up into the Alps. And so they were able to keep us from advancing, and we lost lots of people there without really accomplishing very much. Mussolini was basically taken out of prison by the Germans, and took over a puppet government in the north. June 4th, 1944, the U.S. Fifth Army finally got to Rome. There's a picture of George Patton. By the way, some of you who are familiar with the movie Patton and familiar with George C. Scott playing Patton in his gravelly voice. Patton actually had a high-pitched voice. It doesn't quite fit the image. Most people's image really goes more back to George C. Scott, his image. But he was quite the warrior. All right, that brings us to the Tehran meeting. So fall 1943, Tehran, Iran. We had another meeting, but this meeting now, Casablanca Conference, was just between Churchill and Roosevelt. The Tehran meeting also now included Joseph Stalin as well. First time they had met with him. And of course, again, the big focus was on an invasion of France. Again, Stalin was pushing for the idea of getting lots of pressure from the West to pull pressure off Russia. And so the idea was to invade Nazi-controlled France at the same time that Russia would start a big push to the West, so that Germany would be caught between, was the idea. The three leaders agreed when the war was over, they would create an international organization, the United Nations, basically roughly equivalent to the idea of Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, but hopefully one that worked better. So one of the ways they had to do this was the strategic bombing of Europe. In order to prepare for an invasion, the idea was to weaken the infrastructure of Germany, weaken their ability to continue to maintain war supplies, things like oil, ball bearings, things like that. So basically, D-Day was the day the invasion would begin, and so the U.S. Army Air Force, and along with the Royal Air Force, basically tried to do as much damage as they could to the German and the German morale. And so they dropped thousands of bombs, 350,000 civilians were killed. But it didn't stop the war production. The Germans were able to rebuild, relocate factories, do things like that. German morale didn't suffer that much. As we all know, sometimes when we're faced with adversity, instead of giving up, sometimes we just hang in there and get tougher about our battles. A lot of Allied planes were shot down, and when you shoot down a bomber, you're shooting down 6, 8, 10, 12 people, not just one person. But it did work to the extent that the Germans had to devote more effort to air defense, and that eventually affected their Air Force and their ability to fight. They pretty much ended up waging the war, the last couple of years of war, on the defensive also. By 1944, we pretty much controlled the air over Europe. So it was time to plan for an invasion. Again, if you're looking for this in the book, you should be somewhere around page 977. And another test question, okay? This is the D-Day and after here. Early 1944, Dwight Eisenhower, who had led the invasion of North Africa, arrived in London with the title of Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, which would include not only Americans, but the British as well. The Allied Expeditionary Force would be the one that would invade Western Europe, invade France, and so Eisenhower is now in charge of that. So a test question on that. Could be a matching question, could be a multiple choice question. So Eisenhower's job was to plan Operation Overlord, okay? Overlord. Operation Overlord was basically the assault on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And again, if you've watched the video or seen movies, you know, you're aware of just all the stuff that went into that with the concrete and the wire and the guns and all that stuff. And so mines, machine guns, barbed wire, other things just tossed out there to create problems along the French coastline. And so obviously to attack where they were expecting to attack was going to make things very, very tough. So for months, Eisenhower was involved in trying to plan this. Again, as I said, he'd never been a combat commander. And even though he was very intelligent and very smart, he didn't have a lot of experience other than what he gained in North Africa and in Sicily. And there were also political issues as well, too. You had Patton who wants to lead things, and you have British people who want to be out there leading things too. And we're trying to maintain a balance of relationships with the British and with the Russians. And so he's got to work along with that too. So obviously invading France, one of the reasons Churchill had been opposed to this earlier was that it was a big gamble. It's kind of an all or nothing thing. It either worked or it didn't work. If it didn't work, the war was essentially over. So basically it did succeed. And again, if you've watched the video on that, which you should have, it succeeded in part because of the surprise, okay? The Allies had intentionally done a lot of things to try to confuse people, trying to lead the Germans into thinking we were not going to attack from the west, that we were going to attack from the south against France. And if you saw the video, you know, we made airplanes that weren't airplanes and tanks that weren't tanks, and they put Patton in charge of an imaginary army who was planning for attack on the south because the Germans recognized what a warrior Patton was, and so whatever group he was leading would obviously be the one that would attack them, and so it was set up where he would be the one who would attack at Pas-de-Calais, which was on the French-Belgian border. Okay, that was where the English Channel was the narrowest. Okay, and so it looked logically that's where they would attack. He would be led by Patton, and so the Germans were led to believe that. In reality, we were going to attack 50 miles further away along the coast of Normandy, okay? About 200 miles away. So June 5th, 1944, you've probably seen the pictures, and Eisenhower visited some of the 16,000 American paratroopers who were going to drop behind German lines. So before we attacked directly on the frontal attack, we were going to drop paratroopers behind lines, paratrooping or in gliders. Again, if you've had a chance to visit the Silent Wings Museum at the Lubbock Airport, you're familiar with a lot that was involved there. So paratroopers parachuted, and also we use gliders to put troops behind American lines. And of course, this is the summertime, and they'll be there for a long time. And they'll be there once it's winter time as well too. So we're getting ready. So the planes go over to drop the paratroopers, and basically, obviously, they're being shot at, and they didn't always land in the right place. Some dropped a long ways from each other. Some were dropped far out at sea, actually. Some were unfortunately dropped so low they never had a chance to open their parachutes. And in the end, 82nd Airborne Division, 101st Airborne Division basically attacked 3 German divisions on that night and basically set up for the Normandy landings, okay? So that's your next test question, the Normandy landings, page 979. So basically, invasion was supposed to have been June 5th. It was put off because of weather. June 6th weather was not a whole lot better, but Eisenhower made the decision that we're going to do this anyway. So D-Day, June 6, 1944, largest invasion fleet in history, somewhere around 5,300 Allied ships carrying 370,000 soldiers and sailors invaded Normandy. Basically, there were 5 beachheads. There were 2 American beachheads, 2 British beachheads, and 1 Canadian beachhead. Of course, Omaha Beach, which is one of the 2 American beaches, was the one that had the biggest problems. Lots of luck is actually involved in big battles. Eisenhower was lucky. When the Germans saw the ships heading toward Normandy, they figured that was just a diversion to lure them away from Pas-de-Calais. And also the German field commander, Erwin Rommel, remember, who had been the Desert Fox in North Africa, had been recalled by Hitler to take over the Western Front, was visiting his wife. His birthday was coming up. Things didn't look like much was going to happen. So he decided to go home and celebrate his wife's birthday, which was June 6th. So Rommel was not there. That was important too. But it still almost failed. There were a lot of clouds, lots of weather was still there. German anti-aircraft fire created problems for the paratroopers. Bombers missed their actual targets. Basically, over 1,000 men actually drowned getting off their little landing boats before they ever got to the shore. The first U.S. units were at Omaha Beach. The cliffs there were actually 130 feet tall. And German machine guns, mortars, concrete, we lost more than 90% of our men. There were more fatalities at Omaha Beach than all the other 4 beaches combined. But eventually we pushed across the beach up the cliffs. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, 170,000 Allied soldiers, 57,000 of them Americans, were somewhere along the Normandy coastline, which included over 10,000 fatalities as well too. Within 3 weeks, we landed more than 1 million troops, over 500,000 tons of supplies, and 171,000 vehicles. Operation Overlord would be the greatest seaborne invasion in warfare, but overall numbers are small compared to the Soviet offensive launched a few weeks later. Between June and August 1944, the Soviets killed, wounded, or captured more German soldiers than were stationed all of Western Europe, over 350,000. But it was a turning point. Normandy invasion was important. It was a turning point in the war. We were attacking from the west with the British and support by the French as well. Russians attacking from the east, and so the Germans are caught in between. It's just a matter of time. Okay, it would take 7 more weeks and a loss of 37,000 more people to get control of Normandy. The Germans lost twice that many, and around 19,000 French civilians were killed as well too. 10 weeks of fighting, German resistance finally falls. A division of Free French Resistance were given the privilege of liberating Paris on August 25th. By mid-September 1944, most of France and Belgium are clear of German troops. Between D-Day and the end of the war, 1.2 million Germans were killed and wounded. But while all this is going on, we have politics going home. There's Eisenhower and the 101st Airborne. By the way, the 101st Airborne were the people who initiated the military expression HUA, H-U-A. H-U-A stands for heard, understood, acknowledged, okay? The Marines, of course, have taken a variation of that, but that was the 101st Airborne thing from World War II, a little extra stuff there. And here's a picture landing at Normandy. These look like Australian and British troops. They don't need helmets. All right, that brings us back to politics in Roosevelt's 4th term. And another test question, okay? So mid-1944, it's time for presidential election, okay? So here's probably I would guess a matching question. So the Republicans nominate the governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey. His name will come up later, Thomas E. Dewey, D-E-W-E-Y. Dewey's big argument was, hey, Roosevelt's getting old. Time for a young guy. This guy's been president forever. He's tired, okay? But the war's going on still. Voters are pretty happy to leave things alone. So again, another test question. So November 7th, 1944, president was elected for a 4th term. All right, that brings us back to converging military fronts, the race to Berlin. So Roosevelt's reelected. By this time, the Allied armies are approaching the German border from the east and the west, the Soviets from the east and the Americans and the British from the west. Churchill is worried that if the Soviets get there first to Berlin, then that means Stalin would control what happened if he's the one who controls that. So he urged Eisenhower to push his troops further to try to beat them there. Eisenhower, though, estimated that would cost us 100,000 American lives to get involved in that race. He had no desire to get involved in such a race. So that brings us to the Yalta Conference. And another test question. This is actually an essay question, okay? There's an essay choice on the Yalta Conference. So essay means I'm expecting more than just a couple sentences. So if you want to answer this question, remember it's choices. You don't have to answer this question. If you want to answer a question at the Yalta Conference, then you might want to expand on whatever notes I give you here and be prepared to do that. So we're closing in on Berlin, and so they have another conference of leadership, the Yalta Conference. Yalta is in the Crimea on the Black Sea, so that's to the south. And so basically Stalin this time, this is his territory, so he invites Churchill and Roosevelt, so he hosts them at the Yalta Conference, basically between February 4th and February 11th in 1945. So they have discussions about now the war's looks like it's coming to an end, at least in Europe, and how they're going to end the war. And so they agree that once Germany surrenders, it's kind of a done deal that Germany's going to surrender. They agree that once Germany surrenders, the Soviets could occupy Eastern Germany, and the Americans and the British would occupy Western Germany. Berlin would be in the Soviet zone, but would also be subject to joint occupation as well. And then later on, they agreed that, well, you know, the French have borne the brunt of all this, that there would also be an occupation zone for France as well, too, just to be fair, because of all their losses. So Stalin's goals at Yalta was to basically get everything back from former Russian territory, particularly in Poland, that had been given after the First World War, and also to control all of Eastern and Central Europe. Roosevelt, by this time, is not only tired, he's also not doing very well healthy. Remember, he's a polio victim anyway, which is a very demanding thing physically, and so he's not doing very well. He's not up for a big fight, and so basically he agrees to what Stalin said because he felt like he needed the Soviets to make the United Nations work after the war, and he needed their help to defeat Japan. He thought he did. The reality was it turned out we didn't need their help, but hindsight's always 20/20. So Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin all signed the Yalta Declaration of Liberated Europe, which Stalin was not happy about, but basically it said in theory, there would be free elections in Europe after the war, and the countries could decide what they wanted to do. Stalin, of course, had no intention of doing that. Basically, he wanted to control Eastern Europe. Anybody can contest that after the war. They were sent off to Siberia, basically. All right, and then brings us to the death of the presidency. Death of the president, early 1944. Germany's close to defeat. By this time, Roosevelt's 63. On the morning of April 12th, 1945, he complained of a headache. Other than that, it seemed to be okay. Lunchtime, suddenly he fell over, fell into a coma, and he died a couple hours later. Within a month, Hitler's empire ends too. In Berlin on April 28th, as the Soviet troops entered the city, Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun, in an underground bunker. And that same day, Allied fighters captured Mussolini and his mistress. Mussolini and his mistress were shot, hung by their heels. On April 30th, Hitler and his wife went to the underground bunker. She poisoned herself, or he poisoned her, one or the other, and he shot himself in the head. Their bodies were taken outside, doused with gasoline, and burned. Okay. On May 2nd, Berlin falls. The Axis forces in Italy surrender the same day. May 7th, the Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces agreed to unconditional surrender. The next day, May 8th, was VE Day. VE Day, basically victory in Europe. Lots of celebrations all around the world, but not all around the world, certainly not in the Pacific. But of course, we recognize there was a war still going on in the Pacific, but people were still pretty excited about Europe. The German economy obviously had to be revived. Hopefully a new democratic government, that was a plan. And basically lots of Europeans would be able to go back home. This is when we, basically there's the Yalta Conference picture. Basically, there's my grandson, okay, all right. There's VE Day. All right, so basically we learned about the Holocaust. There's another test question for you. Basically, we had heard some things during the war, but when the war was ending and we started invading Germany and Eastern Europe, we started finding out really about the extent of the Holocaust. So there's a test question there. The Holocaust, you might remember, was Hitler's effort to destroy the Jews and other groups too. Obviously, there's more Jews probably than anybody else, but it include Poles and Eastern Europeans and Gypsies and anybody that was considered undesirable, homosexuals, prostitutes, communists particularly. We'd heard about it as early as 1942, but it seemed kind of hard to believe. But once we started liberating these death camps and actually seeing Hitler's final solution, we realized that, again, somewhere around 6 million Jews and maybe 1 million Poles and other people were killed. There obviously are people, some of the same people who think we didn't land on the moon, I guess, claim there weren't that many people, but I think it's pretty well accepted. Basically, in 1944, Churchill called the Holocaust the most horrible crime ever committed in the history of the world. And that was before he knew that Stalin's death camps were more. Stalin would kill 20 to 30 million of his own people, a whole lot more than Hitler actually did. Not to say Hitler's stuff wasn't bad, it was, but we had an ally who was just as bad. All right, that brings us to the Pacific War. And another essay question, okay? Obviously a lot more material there. So there's an essay choice in the Pacific War. If you're gonna answer that question, I ought to see a pretty good answer there because there's a lot of material available in the Pacific War. And so within that, let's look at some other questions, maybe a multiple choice question. So basically, after, go back to Pearl Harbor, go back to 1941. So for the initial period of time after Pearl Harbor attack, things looked kind of bad, okay? The Japanese were able to move quickly through the Pacific, capture lots of territories in Asia, including the British colonies of Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, and Singapore, and the French colony of Indochina. So that's a test question for you there. So the Philippines, in the Philippines, remember the Philippines was our possession after the Spanish-American War, the War of 1898. Basically, U.S. forces and Filipino forces were quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese invaders. On April 10th, 1942, the Japanese gathered 12,000 American troops and 66,000 Filipinos, forced them up a 65-mile march in 6 days up the Bataan Peninsula, what was called the Bataan Death March. More than 10,000 died along the way. By the summer of 1942, Japan basically had control pretty much of their Asian empire and were ready to attack Australia when basically the Japanese leaders started pushing for more, and that's what got them in trouble, okay? They wanted to attack Australia and also Hawaii again. So during the spring of 1942, we finally started seeing some success. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, that's on your slide there, the Battle of Coral Sea, or in your book, if you're looking for that, page 986. Battle of Coral Sea was from May 2nd through 6th of 1942. There was a Japanese fleet that was on its way to New Guinea. We sunk an aircraft carrier and destroyed about 70 planes. We were able to push that back. A few weeks later, the Japanese naval commander, Admiral Yamamoto, basically pushed towards Midway. Battle fleet, 86 warships. Midway basically was the westernmost of Hawaii's inhabited islands. He hoped to attack there and then attack Pearl Harbor again. This time, though, it was the Japanese that were taken by surprise. Americans had broken the Japanese military codes, and so basically the naval commander in the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was a Texan, by the way, a famous Texan involved in World War II, he was the commander of the U.S. Central Pacific Fleet. Using the broken codes, he knew where Yamamoto was headed. So the Japanese hit Midway on June 4th, 1942, but lost a third of their aircraft. American planes from the Yorktown and Enterprise basically were able to destroy the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway was the first major defeat for the Japanese Navy in 350 years. And most people might want to make sure if you do your essay, this is in there, the Battle of Midway is considered the turning point in the Pacific War. That brings us to MacArthur, okay? Douglas MacArthur, you guys remember him. So here's another test question for you. So both American and Australian forces were under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who had been brought back out of retirement to do this, okay? He had retired in 1937, but in mid-1941, he was called back into service. In 1942 is when he took over command of the Allied forces in the Pacific. So August 7th, 1942, Japanese were pushed back in New Guinea. MacArthur lands 16,000 Marines on Guadalcanal Island, one of what we call the Solomon Islands, and the Japanese had an air base there. So lots of fighting. Fighting lasted from August 1942 into February 1943. Would be the Japanese first defeat for the army. They lost 20,000 men. We lost less than 2,000 Americans. The Japanese, of course, were all about, they knew how to fight and they were never going to surrender. And so they controlled most of the big islands of the Pacific. And so they were willing to fight to the death. And so General MacArthur who commanded the ground forces, and Admiral Nimitz, who commanded the naval forces, came up with an idea called island hopping, that they would leapfrog. They would focus on just attacking the most important islands, the most critical islands, and then skip over the others, just let the Japanese sit there, okay? And then use air power and sea power. So battles in the Central Pacific, on your slide there, on June 15th, 1944, just 10 days after the D-Day invasion, we liberated several islands, Tinian, Guam, and Saipan, that were controlled by the Japanese. Saipan was important because we had a new aircraft now called the B-29 Super Fortress. And from Saipan, they were close enough to actually attack the Japanese home islands. This battle lasted 3 weeks there. 20,000 Japanese were killed, 3,500 Americans died. But 7,000 Japanese soldiers actually committed suicide rather than be captured, which gave us a feeling, a vibe for what was going to happen in the future. General MacArthur's forces invaded the Philippines. MacArthur had actually been in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. He was ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines, and he left with the promise that I shall return. Lots of different issues about that, about who would leave their forces, but again, he was ordered to do that. So basically, they finally invade. The Japanese knew that the Philippines was important, and they brought in warships from all sorts of directions to battle the U.S. fleet. There were 4 battles fought in the Philippine Sea in that midweek of October. They were called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the largest naval engagement in world history, and the worst Japanese defeat of the entire war. By the end of the first day, that was October 23rd, the Japanese had lost 36 warships, including 4 aircraft carriers. This was also the first time we really were presented with kamikazes, okay? Kamikaze is a Japanese word. It means divine wind, okay? If you go back in world history, there were 2 separate big invasions of the Japanese islands by the Chinese. And in both cases, hurricanes had destroyed the Chinese fleet. A big hurricane, a divine wind. So history of the Japanese people is they've been protected by a divine wind that has saved them from Japanese invasions twice. Chinese invasions twice. And so the belief was, well, the divine wind could save them again. So the kamikazes were basically young suicide pilots, and they would fill their aircraft with bombs. They would crash them into American warships. From the fall of 1944 to the end of the war, somewhere around 4,000 kamikaze pilots died on suicide missions. 1 in 7 hit an American ship, so there were a lot of misses there too. So after this is over, MacArthur gets to return as he promised he would, and so he walks back into the Philippines and said, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." And there he is, returning, getting his shoes wet. All right, so basically, the closer our forces got to Japan, the worse the fighting got as the Japanese realized they were protecting the homeland. 30,000 U.S. Marines landed in Iwo Jima. My high school principal was among those Marines who landed in Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, like many of these islands, were volcanic islands, and it was only less than 1,000 miles from Tokyo, and we thought that was important. By Saipan, we already had the ability for our bombers to get to Japan. What we did not have was the ability for the fighters to fly and support the bombers, and so Iwo Jima was important, so that was close enough that we could have fighter planes escort the bombers to Japan. And of course, we're getting close to Japan. The Japanese, again, suicide fighters. It took us almost 6 weeks, and we lost 7,000 American lives. Of the 22,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima, 21,000 died. For those of you movie guys, there are two different movies that came out by the same producer several years ago about Iwo Jima, one from the Allied perspective and the other from the Japanese perspective. I think Letters from Iwo Jima was the one from the Japanese perspective. So again, for those who like to find movies, there's some out there. So then the next thing is Okinawa. Okinawa is a Japanese island which is inhabited by mostly ethnic Japanese people. It's not part of Japan per se, but to the Japanese people, it really is. So April 1st, we started our assault on Okinawa. And again, this was close enough that it could be actually used as a staging point for a land invasion of Japan. Largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, over 300,000 troops, 3 months of fighting, 150,000 Japanese were killed, which only left a little bit less than 8,000. They were either captured or surrendered. A third of American pilots and American submariners, a quarter of American submarines lost their lives in Okinawa. So now, once we got Okinawa, we start thinking about the invasion of Japan. That was called Operation Downfall. And so basically, to prepare for Operation Downfall, we started increasing the intensity of bombing, not only to destroy war industries and the ability to fight, but also to try to destroy Japanese civilian morale as well, too. So summer 1944, we started bombing. The head of the U.S. Bomber Command was General Curtis LeMay. General Curtis LeMay actually led the first bombing of Germany and Europe. He was the head of the U.S. Bomber Command, and so he started a campaign of firebombing. So March 9th, 300 B-29 bombers dropped napalm bombs on Tokyo. 16 square miles of the city was destroyed. 100,000 people died, and 1 million lost their homes. We believe that the fire created these hurricane intensity winds of 100 miles an hour that zipped through the city. If you remember, a lot of the Japanese structures were paper-based, balsa wood, things like that. Things burned pretty rapidly. And the reality is actually more Japanese would die in the bombing of Tokyo than died in with the atomic bombs. Kamikaze attacks increased. Japanese killed 100,000 civilians in Manila. And basically, by this August 1945, 66 Japanese cities have been firebombed. All right, that brings us to the atomic bomb and another essay choice on the Chapter 25-26 test, so if you'll be prepared for that. So it didn't look like the Japanese were going to surrender. There were estimates of how many lives would be lost, estimates of over 500,000 American lives lost in invasion of Japan, an estimate of maybe 6 to 10 million Japanese lives that would be lost in defense. And so people weren't really wild about the idea of Operation Downfall, a land invasion. So in early 1945, when after Truman becomes president, after Roosevelt dies, it's the first time he learns about the atomic bomb program, Operation the Manhattan Project. So we had our first successful test of an atomic bomb in New Mexico, and now we knew it would work. And so they selected 2 Japanese cities as targets. Okay, the first city was Hiroshima. That was a port city and also headquarters for the Japanese Army in southern Japan. So July 25th, 1945, not really knowing what would happen with the atomic bomb, the book says not knowing about radiation poisoning. That's true to some extent, but we had have people die from the testing from radiation poisoning. Ordered that the atomic bomb be used if Japan did not surrender before August 3rd. There was lots of debate on whether or not to drop the bomb. For one thing, we didn't really know if it would work. Okay, Truman had said he didn't doubt that it would be used. He knew that we could lose 500,000 people if we invaded Japan. As it turned out, the bomb was much more powerful than we realized. Okay, we had predicted that 20,000 people would be killed. That was quite a bit off. By mid-July 1945, The Allied leaders meet again in Potsdam, Germany, close to Berlin, and they declared what was called the Potsdam Declaration, which basically said Japanese need to surrender by August 3rd or face prompt and utter destruction. So we passed August 3rd, and so on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, Tibbets. Colonel Paul Tibbets was flying the Enola Gay. Enola Gay was named after Tibbets' mother. Okay. Enola Gay took off at 2 a.m. from the island of Tinian for Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., at 31,600 feet, Enola Gay dropped the 5-ton, 10-foot-long uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. In 43 seconds, the bomb exploded at 1,900 feet above the ground, and the fireball went to 40,000 feet, killed 78,000 people. By the end of the war, the death toll would be 140,000 because of other injuries and radiation poisoning. In addition, the city's 76,000 buildings were almost all destroyed. The city was turned to rubble. 2 days later, after August 8th, the Soviets, realizing that they've got to move along here to share in the victory, entered the war, okay, by sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Manchuria, which the Japanese controlled in China. Truman and was frustrated by the fact that the Japanese still did not want to surrender, and they were worried about the Soviets getting there too quickly again, ordered a second bomb. This one was called Fat Man. So Little Boy was a uranium-235. So uranium-235, Little Boy as a uranium bomb. Uranium is a naturally occurring element, okay? Fat Man was actually a totally different type of bomb. It was an atomic bomb, but it was a plutonium bomb. Plutonium is a technologically engineered element. And so Fat Man was ordered to be dropped, okay? So on August 9th, the target was the city of Kokura. The book doesn't talk about that, but the city was Kokura, Kokura. And the bomber, again, none of this is in the book, was commanded by Major Charles Sweeney. It was a borrowed aircraft. It was not his aircraft. It actually belonged to Major Box. It was called Boxcar, like B-O-C-K' car. And so Major Charles Sweeney was flying Boxcar and headed for Kokura. But Kokura was covered by fog. There was no way to really isolate the target, so they went to their alternative target, which was Nagasaki. So on August 9th, Nagasaki, that was a shipbuilding center, got their bomb, and that was same type of nuclear effects as before. So 5 days later, August 14th, 1945, the Japanese emperor decided, okay, these military guys have had too much say here, and I'm in charge. And so he accepted terms of surrender. A formal surrender ceremony occurred on the American warship, the USS Missouri, in Tokyo Bay on September 22nd, 1945. One of the people on board that ship was John McCain's grandfather, if you remember Senator John McCain. So basically, and there's the aftermath of a Little Boy. This is Hiroshima. All right, so basically, that brings us to the last part of the chapter, page 991, called "A New Age is Born." Okay, so biggest, most deadliest war in world history. It was a total war. Total war implies the idea that it's not just soldiers fighting, but civilians. Everybody's involved in the concept. So it was a total war. Basically, somewhere around 50 million civilians and 22 million combatants died during the war. For us, it was more costly than any other foreign war. Obviously, the deadliest war in American history for Americans was the Civil War, because you had Americans fighting Americans. But in the foreign war, we had nearly 300,000 combat deaths, we had 114,000 non-combat deaths, and 1 million wounded. And a lot of those that were wounded were seriously disabled. Basically, in proportion to our civilian population, though, obviously our losses were much less than our allies suffered during the war. And of course, other than Pearl Harbor, we weren't really affected directly on American soil. For every American killed in the Second World War, 59 Soviets died. That's a big, big difference there. Nazism, German, Italian fascism, both were gone. Militarism in Japan was gone. Japan would never again have a military force. They would have defense forces, but basically things would change totally. And of course, the Germans too, they become very pacifistic as well. The war also set in motion the fall of China communism. Once the war was over, the nationalist Chinese and the communist Chinese were no longer allied fighting the Japanese. By 1949, mainland China would fall to communism. And by 1950, we were fighting the Korean War. Colonial empires in Africa and Asia fell apart. There were some attempts, the British attempt to regain theirs. So we'll see the French attempt to regain theirs. And the Soviet Union came out as a, as a global superpower. So lots of factors. As far as for one thing, we were better at coordinating our efforts than the Germans and the Italians. Obviously, the Japanese were. By 1944, Hitler was becoming. He was never the most stable person anyway in the first place, but by 1944, he was becoming more and more unstable and unpredictable. He still felt like he was a military genius, even though he was only a corporal in World War I, and many times went against his generals' ideas about what he should do. And so basically less and less involved in the German people. And there was even an attempt, as you know, by high-ranking officers to assassinate him in July. Some of you probably saw the movie Operation Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, and which is fairly historical as movies go. So there were lots of attempts to do that. By the end of 1944, the productivity of American industry and the ability of the Soviets to take a lot of losses and still keep on fighting basically caused the demise of the German regime. By the end of the war, Japan ran out of food and Germany ran out of fuel. As in the First World War, the Second World War would kind of change the scope of things worldwide too. It basically did away with the old world order. There was a new international system. France, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, they were the big powers in the past, and now that had changed, okay? Internationalism was now how we looked at things. Basically, most Americans recognized that we couldn't be isolationists forever, that we had responsibilities for global stability and security. I'm ignoring that telephone. Okay, somebody else can answer it. Basically, essentially, from the American point of view, we had ended the Great Depression with World War II, and now presidential authority had increased significantly. Basically, congressional power, state power diminished in terms of what the president could do, and basically we would launch a big period of prosperity to follow on from the Great Depression. Lots of war creates also lots of technologies, lots of things have taken place there. And so basically new technologies, new products have been developed for military purposes can now be used for other purposes. Private sector now created lots of new consumer products and opportunities that the war created for minorities, for women wouldn't make immediate changes, but would set in motion social changes that would culminate in the civil rights movements in the 1960s and the feminist movements in the 1970s. A little over a century after Alexis Tocqueville had said that Europe would be overshadowed by the powers of the United States and Russia, his prophecy had actually come to pass. All right, that ends chapter 26, okay? So you need to think in terms of finalizing your notes on chapter 25 and 26, exactly when we'll do the test, how we do the test. I haven't decided that yet. Figure probably sometime in the next week or so that'll happen. We'll probably do stuff on chapter 27 before we rush into the chapter 25, 26 test. There's always hopes that we can get back together the school right now, that's not looking like it's too likely to happen anytime soon, but you never know. So be working on those notes, getting them ready. You should start looking at chapter 27. The next part of the book is called The American Age, and that covers several chapters. So start looking at chapter 27, reading that, taking some notes. Obviously, I can't give you any quizzes unless you're in the classroom, but you need to be prepared. And also working on your research projects. Most of you have got your topics approved. I think there's only a couple people that don't have their topics. Let's see, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, about 3 of you don't have topics. So y'all can be working on that, and we'll anticipate what's going to happen in the future, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys sometime soon. And we'll see whether or not this works. Otherwise, I may have just spent a whole time practicing for something and nothing happens. See you later.